The Omnipotent Self, a study in self-deception and self-cure by Paul Bousfield. Part 2, Practical Applications. Chapter 10, Self-Analysis. In attempting to cure ourselves of hyper-narcissistic characteristics, there are several lines of treatment which may be followed, some of which depend upon the particular manifestation of narcissism with which we have to deal. One, however, which should be followed in every case, we borrow from the methods of psychoanalysis. We cannot call it psychoanalysis because the technique employed by an amateur in examining himself must be vastly different from the technique employed by a psychoanalyst in dealing with his patient. But it is a modification of one detail of which the technique of psychoanalysis, which, if properly applied, may have far-reaching results. It is on the lines of that phenomenon which is known generally as abreaction and is as follows. When an individual has come to the conclusion that he is suffering from some characteristic of narcissistic nature, which he would rather be without, he should, first of all, carefully call to mind and, if possible, make historical notes of the situations which stimulate the particular temperamental reaction to which he objects. If he can, he should go further than this and recall as many as possible of the actual situations of recent date when this particular reaction has been called forth. If he have an ungovernable temper, for example, he should in detail go first into the type of situations which call forth that temper. And secondly, he should revise in detail the recent occasions upon which he has lost his temper. And thirdly, he should attempt to find out the particular moment, the particular words, the particular occasion which first began to stir feelings of temper within him before he actually began to show violent manifestations of it. Having all these things set forth satisfactorily, it would be well if he spent half an hour every day for a considerable period in performing the next part of the treatment. He should go into a room by himself where he will not be disturbed, recline on a couch or a comfortable chair, and allow his mind to drift backwards year by year, remembering as far as possible every instance on which the unfavorable symptom has been called forth. He will find that if he does not concentrate too hard, but merely keeps in mind the various causes of his temper and recent manifestations of it, other times and instances will come into his mind unbidden. He will, in fact, be surprised at the amount of detail which he can remember concerning the matter. Things which he had not thought of for years, happenings which he had passed over as trivial, will come into his mind and be found to have stimulated in some way or the other the ill temper or other narcissistic trouble which he is endeavoring to get rid of. He must take himself as far as possible right into childhood. He will not necessarily, of course, go back as far as this on the first few occasions. But after he has been at work on himself in this way for some days, he should have no trouble whatever in beginning to recall some of the infantile occasions upon which his narcissism called forth temper. In all the instances which he brings up into his conscious mind, he should write down and study not only the facts remembered, but also the emotions which he felt. These he should examine from every possible point of view and see what narcissistic element appears to be present in them. Many memories will come into his mind of an infantile nature which do not express the particular symptoms from which he now suffers, but will obviously have some bearing on it. These he should examine in the same way, because it is important for him to get into his conscious mind as much as possible of the various occasions in his life on which narcissism acted, when he was not conscious of it. Not only must he see how these various occasions were exhibitions of narcissism, but he must try to trace them back and must compare them with his typical infantile methods of expression. These may be represented by shouting, crying, stamping, weeping, or any other infantile manifestations of those omnipotent fantasies which now seem to him to be the starting point of his more recent expressions of them. He has, in fact, to lay bare before himself as much as possible of his previously unconscious narcissistic life, its beginnings, its evolution, and its ultimate form. This making conscious of what was previously unconscious or but partially conscious is in itself a most potent factor in improvement. If he will have the patience to steadily persevere and to go over daily for a considerable period the material he has brought to the surface. If he does not do this regularly, it is liable to sink back and become once again an unconscious factor and a determinant to his actions over which he has no control. This bringing into consciousness the unconscious causes and motives underlying behavior is, in psychoanalysis, one of the powerful factors at work producing cures of neurotic obsessions and so forth, and it is equally potent with the minor temperamental abnormalities with which we are dealing here. For it means that previous mental conflicts which were either wholly or partially unconscious are now rendered conscious habitually, and a conscious conflict, or rather a conflict in which the forces at work become conscious, is far easier to direct than one in which the very forces themselves are hidden and unknown. Let us take a more material example for comparison. Suppose an officer to be in command of a company of soldiers out in the desert and attacked on a dark night by savages. It might very well be that he was well armed and his machine guns were efficient, but that he would be quite overwhelmed because he would neither see the savages nor know their numbers, their whereabouts, or their armaments. But supposing that the War Office had thoughtfully equipped him with one or two good searchlights, which he could direct upon the savages so that the number of savages, their armaments, position, and so forth could be brought into his consciousness, he would be in a far better position, for he could direct his machine guns at the threatened points, instead of being forced to fire them wildly and as likely as not miss his targets altogether. Exactly the same happens when these manifold feelings to which I have just been referring. The more one can see them, their histories, their evolution, their beginnings, the more one holds them in consciousness, the easier does the conflict between good and evil become in the individual. Again, this method of self-help, which I have given here, differs considerably from that pursued in psychoanalysis, in that it is following up only one unconscious factor, albeit one of the most important factors. But in psychoanalysis, we follow up in turn all the unconscious forces at work, great and small, and in any temperamental abnormality, there are certainly many more unconscious factors than narcissism concerned, although narcissism may be the predominant one. Thus, for instance, alcoholism, though always possessing a narcissistic element, frequently has other determinants present of an exceptionally strong nature. Footnote: alcoholism is further complicated by the fact that a habit of physical craving is formed, which as a rule cannot be overcome by mental treatment alone. This craving, fortunately, can now be eradicated by medical means. Indeed, patients of mine have been cured of all desire for alcohol in about 1 week as a rule. The patient is then in somewhat the same condition as a man who has never tasted alcohol, and he will have no craving for alcohol thereafter unless he deliberately drinks it again. Herein, however, we see the importance of the psychic factor, for should the cured alcoholic begin again to take alcohol, either because he thinks that he has attained self-control and can do so, or because he finds abstinence difficult on social grounds, he will almost inevitably regress to his old condition of uncontrolled desire, no matter how long has elapsed since he was cured of it. The same causes which originally led him to excess, viz., his mental complexes, are still present and again produce similar results. Of course, a very large proportion of those who have been cured by medical treatment do not relapse, because they have sufficient common sense not to experiment with themselves. In the other cases, however, the only hope of a permanent cure consists in following up the physical treatment with mental treatment, analysis. On the other hand, in most cases of drug taking, a medical cure is generally sufficient, for there is no social urge to take drugs as there is in the case of alcohol, and once the craving has been cured, the tendency to experiment again is the exception rather than the rule. But even here, it is found that any indulgence in the drug, however slight, will again produce in the individual his old craving. He has found a previous path of narcissistic regression and will inevitably follow it, for though the craving has been eradicated, the complexes remain. There are many potential alcoholics and potential drug takers in the world. They will never know it unless unfortunate chance induces them to open that particular channel of regression. Back to chapter. So that while an analysis of narcissism only may be of the greatest value in some cases, in others where narcissism does not occupy so great a field, the other unconscious factors are too potent to allow much benefit to accrue from a partial self-analysis of this kind. In drug taking, however, there is a slight difference from alcoholism, for, as a rule, narcissism is nearly always the essential factor. It will be understood that narcissism links itself to almost any other characteristic, influencing it for the worse by fixing it more deeply and holding it back from becoming conscious more strongly than would otherwise be the case. The patient will find himself during this self-examination repeatedly trying to excuse himself. He will find himself saying, "I remember on such an occasion losing my temper, but on that occasion I was perfectly justified." Or in another instance, he may say, "I remember weeping," or "I remember being depressed or angry or impatient. But circumstances then existed which seemed to me proper occasions for such a manifestation to have taken place." Let me emphasize at the outset that any such excuses will be rationalizing, that he must say to himself, whether they appear normal or abnormal according to accepted standards, those occurrences most certainly had their narcissistic factor. For it must be understood that although there are many occasions when impatience or weeping may be looked upon conveniently as normal occurrences, that is only because everybody possesses certain imperfections due to narcissism, and if one is going to attempt to improve one's temperament in this way, every occasion must be examined without excuse or rationalization. Otherwise, the individual who is thus at work upon himself will only succeed in defeating himself to his own detriment by putting up a resistance to his cure or improvement. And indeed, one of the important factors in this work, just as in psychoanalysis itself, is the factor which comes into play in overcoming these resistances of seeing ourselves as we are, of seeing the evolution and beginnings of our temperament as it really was. It is bound to reveal in all of us, without exception, much that is unpleasant, and that we would rather not see. Resistance to seeing such material is inevitable. If the examination is sufficiently thorough, if no resistance has to be overcome, the individual may be certain that he is shirking the facts. End of chapter 10.